Concerned about divisions within the Church of Ephesus, the Apostle Paul wrote, "There is one body and one Spirit, just as you were called to one hope when you were called. One Lord, one faith, one baptism, one God and Father of all, who is over all and through all and in all." Historically speaking, Christians desire unity with each other, but they also want to be free to express their faith according to their own distinctive cultures. When Christianity expanded throughout and beyond the Mediterranean world, Christians encountered a variety of languages and cultures, which impacted how they understood the faith and lived their lives. From the 4th century onward, the Roman Empire began to split into two regions. Christians in the Western Roman Empire, encompassing the Western Mediterranean world, had their geographical focus on Rome, and Latin became the dominant language of their theological conversations. This group of churches eventually became known as Catholic, a term which means universal. Ignatius of Antioch, in his letter to the Smyrnians, chapter 8, verse 2, is the first to use the word Katholikos, or Catholic, to refer to the universal church of his day. While the term Catholic and Orthodox would be used by both Western and Eastern Christians throughout their history, with the rise of Protestantism in the 16th century, the term Catholic became the preferred term for the Western churches who submitted to the authority of the Pope in Rome, and the term Orthodox became the preferred term for the Eastern churches who submitted to the authority of multiple patriarchs. The geographical focus of Christians was more diversified in the Eastern Roman Empire, also known as the Byzantine Empire, which encompassed the Eastern Mediterranean world. Eastern Christians still recognized the Bishop of Rome as one of the main leaders, or patriarchs, of the Church, but they also recognized the patriarchs of Constantinople, Alexandria, Antioch, and Jerusalem. Eastern Christians tend to operate independently according to churches within a country, such as Greece, Russia, Egypt, or Serbia. Greek continued to be the dominant language of theological conversations in the East. This group of churches is broadly referred to as Orthodox, a term which means correct, as in understanding the truth correctly and living it accurately. When theological controversies arose, Christians would discuss the matters in their own churches and eventually send their leaders to meetings with other church leaders for further discussion. Ecumenical councils were the attempts of Eastern and Western church leaders representing all major centers of Christianity to gather to discuss theological controversies. They hoped to arrive at a theological consensus. The ecumenical councils that met in Nicaea, 325, Constantinople, 381, Ephesus, 431, and Chalcedon, 451, especially focused on the person of Jesus Christ, namely, how the Church should understand and explain the divinity and humanity of Jesus Christ in such a way that is both faithful to Scripture but also systematically consistent. The council that met in Chalcedon concluded that Jesus exists in two natures, without confusing the two natures, without transmuting one nature into the other, without dividing them into two separate categories, without contrasting them according to area or function. In other words, the divine and human natures of Jesus are united unconfusedly, unchangeably, indivisibly, and inseparably. While the Western churches found the definition suitable, the Eastern churches had strong reactions that resulted in the splintering of Eastern Christianity into three distinct groups. Those who stood by the definition of Chalcedon were called the Chalcedonians, or Byzantine Orthodox. These are the churches, especially associated with the Patriarch of Constantinople, who sought to maintain their ties with Rome and the Western Church. There was a close relationship between the Byzantine Emperor and the Church. They often sought compromises with the other Eastern and Western churches in the name of maintaining theological unity, but also to protect their political influence. The second group was known as the Oriental Orthodox, or Non-Chalcedonians. They agreed with the explanation of Jesus Christ given by Cyril, Patriarch of Alexandria, in a dispute between Cyril and Nestorius, the Patriarch of Constantinople. This dispute is what led to the Council of Chalcedon in the first place. This group claimed that Jesus came out of two natures, one divine and one human, but both fused into one nature from the time of his conception. The Coptic, Syrian, Armenian, and Ethiopian churches belong to this group. Another reason these churches separated from the others in the East is that these churches were among the non-Greek cultures. They desired some autonomy from the Greek-dominated Byzantine Church. The third group was known as the Church of the East, or Assyrians, who sided with the Patriarch Nestorius in his disagreement with Cyril. Nestorius taught that Jesus had two persons inside of him, one divine and one human. Nestorius rejected the idea that Mary could be called the Theotokos, or bearer of God, because she was only bearing the human, not the divine, person inside of her. This group of churches would be the first to encounter Muslims as they began to move north and west from the Arabian Peninsula. Many people in the Western world are unaware that the Christian Church divided into factions and denominations long before the Protestant Reformation. Because of its geographic and cultural setting in the Western Roman Empire, the Roman Catholic tradition is often the only ancient church tradition people in the Western world encounter on a regular basis, so it is the only one they are familiar with. Therefore, it is important to recognize that Roman Catholicism is only one Christian tradition among many that can trace their roots back to the beginnings of Christianity. About the year 482, Justinian was born to peasants in what is today North Macedonia. His uncle Justin, who was a peasant soldier, adopted Justinian at an early age, brought him to Constantinople, and ensured he received a great education there. Justinian then served as an advisor to Uncle Justin, who rose quickly through the ranks. When the emperor died, Justin was proclaimed the new emperor. Justinian continued to assist his uncle and eventually was appointed co-emperor in 527. Justinian convinced his uncle to repeal a law forbidding marriage of people in different classes, which opened the door to Justinian marrying Theodora. Theodora was also of humble origins. She was the daughter of a bear trainer in the circus in Constantinople, and she herself became an actress, prostitute, and lewd comedic dancer. However, she disappeared for a while, but when she returned to Constantinople, she caught the eye of Justinian. They got married, continuing in love and mutual respect for the rest of their lives. Shortly after they were married, Emperor Justin died, and Justinian and Theodora were crowned emperor and empress at the Hagia Sophia by Epiphanius, Patriarch of Constantinople, in the year 527. As co-emperors, they frequently discussed and often deferred to one another in political and religious matters of the empire. Justinian was more of a Chalcedonian Christian. That is, he backed the wording of the definition of Chalcedon in terms of understanding how to explain the person of Jesus Christ. Theodora, on the other hand, was partial to Cyril of Alexandria's explanation of Jesus, which put her in favor with the churches in Syria and Egypt against what they considered to be the heresy of Nestorianism. One of Justinian's chief goals was to reclaim parts of the Western Empire lost to the Vandals and Goths in the previous century. It took 2 decades and most of his resources, but he recaptured Italy and North Africa to bring them back into his empire. This gave Justinian and Theodora deep and wide power throughout the Mediterranean world. However, to secure the West, Justinian had to thin out his defenses on the eastern border of his empire by arranging a peace with Persia and leaving the outer eastern region susceptible to attacks from the east. Justinian believed that religious unity was essential to political stability, so he sought to unify the religious landscape by outlawing paganism and heresy. Non-Christians were even required to be baptized. The battle for religious unity in the Byzantine Empire was waged on 2 fronts: unity between Rome and Constantinople, and unity among the various Eastern groups of churches. To accomplish this, undoubtedly with the help of Theodora, he published an edict which gave a definition of Jesus Christ that was faithful to the official definition of the Council of Chalcedon, but also conciliatory toward the Cyrillian churches in Syria and Egypt. Justinian claimed that the first 4 ecumenical councils embraced the true core of Christian beliefs. Additionally, the edict recognized the Bishop of Rome as the head of the entire church, though Justinian claimed the power to depose popes if they did not comply with his wishes. From 526 to 741, the election of Roman bishops had to be confirmed by Constantinople. Never before, and perhaps never since, has a head of state wielded such widespread religious power. To ensure a bond with the non-Chalcedonian churches, Justinian also condemned the Three Chapters, which consisted of the writings of three theologians who opposed Cyril's teaching and promoted what the Council of Chalcedon called the Nestorian heresy: Theodore of Mopsuestia, Theodoret of Cyrus, and Ibas. Religious unity in the empire required legal backing to be enforced. Justinian put the empire's top jurists to the task of collecting all laws of the empire, which were written prior to Justinian's reign. Jurists then made some commentaries on the laws, keeping in mind the central role of Christianity, and the final product was known as the Justinian Code. It was intended to endure far beyond Justinian's reign as the central legal document of the empire. It encompassed both secular and ecclesiastical forms of leadership and their relationship with one another. It was both a political and a doctrinal statement for the empire. It also made some progress in terms of human rights, raising the legal status and power of the empire's lowest classes to at least a minimum level of humanity. The code itself rewarded those who were faithful to the church and the emperor in Constantinople, but conversely, it pushed away numerous groups who found it oppressive. Justinian died in the year 565, but he and Theodora left behind a legacy in which he attempted to resurrect and unify the old Roman Empire under the headship of the Pope in Rome, but with the center of power in Constantinople. He sought to unify the various groups of churches to bring about religious and political stability, which lasted throughout his reign. After his death, however, Italy was captured by the Lombards, the eastern churches continued to splinter, and the eastern borders remained relatively unsecured. The idea of Europe as it is today did not come into existence until Catholic missionary monks began sharing the gospel in Northern Europe. Historian Douglas Jacobson wrote, "At the time when the Roman Empire first became Christian, the idea did not exist of a place called Europe. The Roman Empire was a water-based domain circling the Mediterranean Sea, and the area of land now known as Europe was simply the northern hinterland." Waves of Germanic tribes, also known as barbarians, migrated from Central Europe, especially in the 4th and 5th centuries AD, slowly occupying the western lands of the Roman Empire until the last Western emperor, Romulus Augustus, was deposed in 476. Political boundary lines were then drawn by neighboring tribes throughout Europe. Most of these Germanic tribes were pagan in their religious beliefs, but some were discovered to be Arians. How did Arian theology become popular among some of the Germanic tribes? The Arian missionary Ulfilas, who was born among the Goths in Central Europe in about the year 311, spent much of his life as a young man in Constantinople. Ulfilas was sent as a missionary to the Goths in particular, while Arianism was gaining ground in the mid-4th century, so his converts held to the heresy of Arianism. Generations later, they invaded and settled in the land of the Western Roman Empire. What were the Christians of the former Western Roman Empire to do? These Western Christians, or the ones who later came to be known as Catholic Christians, spent the next 5 or 6 centuries talking to their new Germanic tribal leaders and kings about the gospel and the Orthodox theology of the Council of Nicaea. One major difference between the Catholics and the Germanic tribes was that the people of the Germanic tribes tended to convert to whatever religion their leaders chose to follow. Therefore, Catholic missionaries focused their efforts primarily on the Germanic tribal leaders. Some of the most successful and notable missionary movements in this era began in the British Isles. Christianity first spread into the British Isles when Roman armies conquered the southern portion of England in AD 43. Christians among the Roman invaders brought their early form of Christianity to the region. 4 centuries later, in the year 402, the Roman armies retreated to concentrate on defending Rome. England's first notable missionary was Ninian, who grew up among the Britons and was ordained and commissioned to preach the gospel to the Britons, Celts, and Pikes that lived in the area between Hadrian's Wall and the Antonine Wall. He began by attempting to organize the disorganized churches that already existed there and then attempted to share the gospel with pagan leaders. In the year 397, Ninian established a center of operations called the White House, as a center from which he and his Catholic monk missionary friends could launch their efforts. The most notable Irish Catholic missionary of this era was Patrick. When he was 16 years old, Irish pirates kidnapped him from his British home and sold him as a slave in Ireland, where he was held for 6 years. He had a dream that he interpreted as a vision from God, which directed him to escape, so he did. After he returned home, he had another dream in which God called him to Ireland to preach the gospel to those who had kidnapped and enslaved him. He obeyed in 432 and began his work among the tribal leaders in Ireland. Within 15 years, according to reports, most of Ireland became Christian. Patrick is credited with the beginning of the Irish monastic movement and Irish Christian tendencies from that time forward. A third person of importance to the founding of the Church in England was Augustine of Canterbury. Augustine was the prior, or the ranking member in charge, of St. Andrew's Monastery in Rome when he and 40 other monks were commissioned by Pope Gregory I to re-establish the Church in England. He arrived at Kent in the summer of 597 and began conversations with King Ethelbert, whose wife Bertha was already a Christian. When the king converted, he allowed Augustine and the missionary monks to continue their work among the Angles and Saxons of his kingdom, as long as the missionaries promised not to use any strong form of coercion. Augustine set up his missionary headquarters in Canterbury, which was the capital city of Kent. As each kingdom converted to Christianity, their ecclesiastical center became Canterbury for all England. Though these missionary monks and church organizers had the blessings of Rome, a distinctly English form of Christianity began to form. Who was to lead the local churches established or re-established by the British monks? Instead of bishops over individual churches, the churches were led by the heads of monastic communities. What should a Christian do after they commit a sin? The distinctly Roman Catholic idea had been to have the sinner perform elaborate rituals over a period of time before being allowed back into a church to worship on the Easter following their sin. And there were only instructions given for what to do for one major sin. The distinctly Irish Catholic idea understood that Christians committed minor sins frequently. So a system of penance developed among the Irish in which they would go to regular confessions to their local priests, who absolved them in a less elaborate and public manner. The Irish practice would later gain in popularity on the continent and eventually become a regular feature of Western Catholic Christianity. The success of missionary monks in the British Isles soon became a model for the establishment of other monasteries and missionary work on the continent. The missionary monks of the early Middle Ages were loyal to Rome, but also adapted their presentation and practice of the gospel to local customs and ways of thinking. This process today is called contextualization, a way to communicate the timeless truths of Christianity to a wide variety of cultures. John of Damascus, also known as John Damascene, is commonly considered the last of the Greek Church Fathers. He is widely read and quoted by Eastern and Western Christian scholars. He himself quotes from previous Greek Fathers in his own theological work, Exposition on the Orthodox Faith. John's work represents a fair summary of the major Greek Fathers before him on the most pressing theological issues of the early 8th century. John was born in the city of Damascus, sometime in the last quarter of the 7th century. He grew up in a Christian family known by the name Mansur, which means ransomed. His father, Sergius, was appointed as the treasurer for Abd al-Malik, the caliph in Damascus. When Sergius died, John was given his father's position, plus a promotion, handling the caliph's funds. Shortly after the year 730, one finds John becoming a monk and entering a monastery named St. Sabas in the Kidron Valley, about halfway between Jerusalem and the Dead Sea. A few years later, he was ordained as a priest in Jerusalem. It is believed that he traveled throughout Palestine and Syria and even made a trip to Constantinople toward the end of his life. He died at St. Sabas sometime around 750. His life is celebrated in the Eastern Orthodox Church on December 4th and in the Roman Catholic Church on May 6th. One of John's chief theological contributions was his support of the use of images or icons in worship. In this discussion, an image is a two-dimensional portrayal of Jesus himself, or a saintly Christian. A controversy arose in the Eastern Church between those who favored using images in worship, who were known as the Iconodules, and those who prohibited the use of images in worship, who were known as Iconoclasts. In the year 726, Byzantine Emperor Leo III issued an edict stating that images were not allowed to be used in church services. Muslims also disliked the use of images in worship. Iconoclasts argued, among other things, that the use of images in worship was a form of idolatry. They based this, in part, on the Old Testament prohibitions against graven images. Exodus 20:4, Leviticus 26:1, Deuteronomy 4:16. John wrote 3 letters on the topic to be circulated among the Eastern churches. His main contribution to the conversation was his focus on Christ. John argued in his letters that when Jesus took on flesh and became a physical human being, the rules on images changed. The incarnation was God's way of saying that Jesus is the image of the invisible God. Colossians 1:15. The prohibitions on physical images in the Old Testament referred to an era that predated the coming of Jesus Christ, and as such, the visible image of the invisible God. John also distinguished between worship, which is only due to God, and veneration, which is a lesser honor reserved for physical objects of spiritual significance. John's other main contribution to theology was his larger work on the Orthodox faith. It was an exposition of important doctrines of the Christian faith, especially from the Eastern Orthodox perspective. In his discourse, John carefully collated writings from prominent Eastern Church Fathers on a variety of topics. The work especially addresses the theological issues of the necessity and knowability of God, the Trinity, creation, providence and free will, the Incarnation, the sacraments, Mary, images, Scripture, virginity, and end times. John was not only looking to the past to provide an exposition of what the Fathers taught, but to the future to provide Christians with answers to Muslim questions and objections to the Christian faith. John of Damascus served as a monk, a priest, and a theologian during a crucial time in the history of the Eastern Orthodox Church. He addressed issues important to Christian thought, as well as objections and concerns of his Muslim neighbors. He was systematic as a collector and organizer of the theological thought. His poetry, letters, and other writings addressed important theological issues from the tradition he received. He is thus known as the last of the Church Fathers in the Eastern Orthodox tradition. In the 8th and 9th centuries AD, a controversy arose, especially within the Eastern Orthodox Church, regarding the use of icons in religious worship and instruction. An icon is a representation of Jesus, Mary, the saints, or angels on a flat surface, either as a painting or a mosaic. Those who upheld the religious use of icons came to be known as iconodules, i.e., lovers of images. Those who decried the religious use of icons came to be known as iconoclasts, or smashers of images. The most heated debate and actions of the controversy took place between 726 and 843. From the time Alexander the Great conquered Eastern Europe, Western Asia, and Northern Africa in the 4th century BC, Greek art and culture spread throughout his empire. Hero worship and art depicting heroes were common in the empire and remained in practice even after the Romans conquered the Greeks. When Eastern Christians depicted their own heroes in art and incorporated that art into their worship and education, Jews and Muslims interpreted this practice as idolatry. Byzantine Emperor Leo III believed the rise of Islam and Muslim invasions were God's punishment for Christian idolatry, and issued edicts in 726 and 730 forbidding the religious use of icons and calling for their destruction. The reaction from iconodules, especially among the monks and lay people, was fierce and sometimes violent. Leo III deposed, exiled, and replaced Germanus, the iconodule patriarch of Constantinople, as part of his quelling of the unrest in the capital. Monk and theologian John of Damascus wrote the iconodule's most comprehensive and systematic work defending the use of icons. In response to the accusation of idolatry, John explained that latria is the highest form of worship and is reserved for God alone. Iconodules, he said, do not worship icons in this sense. However, there is a form of veneration, lower than worship, called proskunesis, and this veneration, he claimed, is appropriate for icons. In response to the accusations of breaking the second commandment about not making graven images, iconodules reminded Iconoclast that God had chosen to use a serpent on Moses' staff to stop a plague in Numbers 21, 4-8, and graven cherubim to cover and protect the Ark of the Covenant in the tabernacle and temple. Iconodules explained that the Old Testament prohibition against making images was only temporary until the Incarnation. Iconodule arguments also included stories of icons speaking, moving, healing, and performing miracles. Iconoclasts rejected those stories as fiction, and both sides claimed their positions more accurately reflected a proper understanding of the human and divine natures of Jesus Christ. Byzantine Emperor Constantine V vigorously continued his father's campaign against icons and convened an iconoclastic synod in Constantinople in 754, which he claimed to be ecumenical. The synod concluded that those who worshipped icons were guilty of Christological errors, and the only valid icon of Christ is the Eucharist. This iconoclastic trend continued among the emperors until the Byzantine Empress Irene turned the tide in favor of the iconodules. She replaced high-ranking officials with iconodules and convened an iconodule council, which history remembers as the Council of Nicaea II in 787. Unlike its 754 predecessor, this council did include representatives of the Pope and of the bishops of Alexandria, Antioch, and Jerusalem. The council destroyed the documents associated with the previous Iconoclast synod and pronounced the errant synod's decisions invalid. There were still two more shifts in the debate before its intensity waned in the mid-9th century. In the East, Emperors Leo V, Michael II, and Theophilus pushed the Byzantine Empire and Eastern Church back in the direction of iconoclasm by reiterating the 754 Synod of Constantinople's decisions. In the West, the new Carolingian Christians of Frankish origin were coming into power and also took a moderate iconoclast position. They believed Eastern Christians were worshipping, not merely venerating, the icons. Thus, the Carolingian theologians, especially Theodulf of Orleans, in his Caroline books, spoke out against the iconodules. The Roman Pope Hadrian, however, took a moderate iconodule position, resulting in a rivalry in the West between the Carolingians and Rome that broke out over the same controversy that had so recently beset the East. The final shift in Constantinople came thanks to Byzantine Empress Theodora, who convoked one more synod in Constantinople in 843, which revived the decisions of the Council of Nicaea II and proclaimed an annual celebration to be held every March 11th, called the Feast of Orthodoxy in the Byzantine traditions. The feast celebrates the end of the icon controversy, and the use of icons in religious contexts of worship and instruction continues among the Eastern Orthodox Church today. Following the fall of the Western Roman Empire in AD 476, Europe became a mosaic of various Germanic states rather than a single entity. The Western Church sent missionaries to these Germanic tribal chiefs to discuss the gospel with them and invite them to convert to Christianity. Even as the various tribes converted in part or in whole to Christianity, there remained an uneasy tension between the Church and state in Europe. When the Lombards, who occupied northern Italy, pressed southward toward Rome to attempt to make it their capital, Roman Christians called for help from their counterparts in Constantinople. The eastern half of the Roman Empire became known as the Byzantine Empire and retained authority over some parts of Italy. There had already been tension between the eastern and western parts of the Church over theological and liturgical matters, so the Byzantine Emperor's refusal to help defend Rome against the invasion of the Lombards left the Pope and citizens of Rome in a difficult situation. They turned northward for help to another Germanic group known as the Franks. The Franks had slowly overcome neighboring Germanic tribes and set up a kingdom in what is now known as France. These new French rulers formed the Merovingian dynasty. While the Merovingian dynasty put kings on the Frankish thrones for 3 centuries, the real military power rested in the army's generals, who took the title of mayor of the king's palace. As the kings grew weaker, the palace mayors grew stronger. The general mayors were able to repel Frisian and Saxon invasions from the north and Muslim invasions at their southern border, especially at the famous Battle of Tours in 732. This halted the Muslim advance further up the continent. The general mayor who stopped the Muslim advance was Charles the Hammer Martel. He was the first of the Carolingian dynasty, who ended up replacing the Merovingians as kings of the Franks. When Charles died in 741, his son, Pepin the Short, consolidated his family's rule over the Franks and was anointed by the local bishop, Boniface, to consecrate the occasion. It was to Pepin that Pope Stephen II appealed for help against the Lombards, who were poised to invade Rome to set up their capital there. In exchange for Pepin's protection in 754, the Pope granted the Frankish king the title of Patrician of Rome, meaning that the Franks would be Rome's new military protectors. When the Lombards again threatened to invade Rome, the Pope appealed to Pepin a second time, promising the latter a long life and glorious mansions in heaven. This time, when Pepin came to the rescue, he granted the Pope the right to govern the central portion of Italy, which thereafter became known as the Papal States. This grant was referred to as the Donation of Pepin, and it set the papacy on a much-debated path of secular authority for years to come. Following the death of Pepin in 768, his son Charlemagne, which is French for Charles the Great, ascended to the throne and assumed the role of protector of the Western Church. Charles was the most able ruler of Western Europe in the early Middle Ages. He is often referred to by historians as a second Constantine because of his political, military, and academic skills. He was described as 6 foot 4 inches, or 1.93 meters tall, athletic, and generous to the church. He was a profoundly pious king and remained loyal to his Christian faith in all personal matters and matters of the state. However, he had little patience for his conquered enemies, who would not convert to Christianity willingly. So, he had thousands of them slaughtered for their lack of belief in the Christian God. When Pope Leo III was the subject of riots in Rome in the year 799, Charlemagne went down to Rome to judge the situation in person. The result of the trial, which Charlemagne presided over, exonerated the Pope and punished his enemies. On Christmas morning in the year 800, when Charlemagne knelt to pray at the altar of St. Peter, the Pope snuck behind him and placed a jeweled crown on his head and had him proclaimed Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, which included northern Italy, Germany, and France. Historians still debate whether Charlemagne had known about this coronation ahead of time, but it set a noteworthy precedent for interactions between the Church and state for the rest of the Middle Ages. On the one hand, the fact that the Pope coronated the emperor gave rise to the belief that the Church had the right to put secular rulers in power and influence state affairs. On the other hand, the fact that the emperor protected the Western Church and received his divine authority from God to do so gave rise to the belief that the state had the right to put church rulers in power and influence church affairs. Essentially, this rivalry between church and state at all levels was one of the chief characteristics of European history throughout the Middle Ages. It especially manifested itself against the threat of Islamic invasion in the East and the rearranging of borders and dynasties throughout Europe. When one refers to Carolingian Catholicism, one thinks of the two-pronged effort to consolidate secular authority under the Holy Roman Emperors of the line of Charlemagne and ecclesial authority under the Pope in Rome, which included jurisdiction over secular matters in the Papal States of Central Italy. Paul wrote to the Ephesians, "There is one Lord, one faith, one baptism." Ephesians 4:3. The eastern and western parts of the Church have had a long history of unity and disunity as Christianity spread around the world. Historians speak of an East-West schism as a singular event that took place in the year 1054 when Cardinal Humbert and some other representatives of Pope Leo IX placed a bull of excommunication on the altar of the Hagia Sophia in Constantinople, excommunicating the Patriarch Michael Cerularius from fellowship with Rome. While this was a significant insult to the Patriarch and a blow to East-West relations, the truth is that the schism had been growing for centuries. The excommunication event of 1054 was just one of many factors that caused the eastern and western parts of the Church to drift apart from one another. When Christianity spread throughout the Roman Empire in the 1st and 2nd centuries AD, the language and culture was primarily Greek. However, in time, scholars in Rome and the Western world shifted to Latin as their primary language. As the centuries went on, Christians in the West became less interested in reading theology in the Greek, and Christians in the East never really took to reading theology in the Latin. This language barrier broke down communication between Christians in both parts of the Church. The political situation became different too. When the Western Roman Empire fell to barbarian invaders in the 5th century, the empire fractured into several kingdoms, and the churches struggled to maintain unity between the kingdoms. They eventually persuaded their barbarian kings of the truth of Christianity, but the political and church situations in the West would remain largely decentralized. Even the orientation of church leadership took on the form of a monarchy, as if the Pope was the sole king of the Western Church, and his bishops became like princes. It was a different story in the East. The Eastern, or Byzantine, emperor retained a firm grip on the Byzantine Empire for another 1,000 years after the Western Empire fell. The emperor, whose capital was in Constantinople, had a close and vital relationship with the Patriarch of Constantinople and the Patriarchs of the Byzantine Church. Christians in the East recognized a college of patriarchs, where the word college is used like a college of surgeons, or the Electoral College in the US, with much equality between equals leading the Church. In 754, following years of separation from the Byzantine Church, Pope Stephen turned his attention northward and developed a relationship with the Frankish kings, Charles the Hammer Martel, Pepin the Short, and Charlemagne. The popes, beginning with Pope Stephen in 754 and continuing from that time forward, focused much on France for their political, economic, and military support. This increased the schism between the eastern and western parts of the Church. There were some theological disagreements that mixed in with political disagreements to further the schism as well. Ask Eastern Orthodox Christians today what the main theological difference is between them and the Roman Catholic Church, and they will say the Filoque controversy. At the Council of Constantinople in 381, the Nicene Creed was ratified, and the Holy Spirit was described as proceeding from the Father. In 437, the bishops of Spain held a council in Toledo at the behest of Leo the Great, who served as a prominent deacon before becoming the Pope of Rome, to address a Trinitarian controversy that had arisen in the region, and, using Leo's language, they added the Latin word filioque, and the Son, to the creed they ratified. This group of Western bishops explained that the Holy Spirit proceeded from the Father and the Son. This became the standard version of the creed in the Spanish-speaking world, and by the 7th century, the French and German translations of the creed included this phrase. The perception in the East was that this exclusively Western council had overreached by taking it upon themselves to modify the wording of a famous creed, whose wording without this phrase had been ratified by an ecumenical council. While these filioque discussions began small, they eventually evolved into a major sticking point in the schism between the Eastern and Western parts of the Church. In the 9th century, both the Eastern and Western churches sent missionaries to the Slavs in Bulgaria, which was in the middle of the two regions of the Church. Disputes broke out as to whether to include the word filioque in the missionary literature or not. This led to a series of councils in Constantinople and Rome about the matter and about who should be recognized as the true Patriarch of Constantinople. Meanwhile, back in the West, the popes in Rome were attempting to solidify their authority over the Western Church among the different barbarian kingdoms. In the process of doing so, they made claims of the pope's authority over the entire Church, East and West. Naturally, these claims were ill-received by Eastern Christians, who were willing to recognize the Pope as the Western Patriarch, but only as one among a college of patriarchs. By the 11th century, the papacy grew to the height of its political power and made strong assertions of Rome's authority over the entire Church. While Pope Leo IX did not immediately excommunicate Patriarch Michael Cerularius, the Pope signed a document, primarily written by Cardinal Humbert, which authorized the cardinal to take extreme action if an investigation in Constantinople warranted. Humbert hastily placed the bull of excommunication on the altar of the Hagia Sophia and left the city, thus dramatically formalizing the schism between East and West. The Crusades really solidified the schism and caused it to endure because of the poor behavior of the Crusaders in Constantinople and disagreements about who should be in charge of the Church in Antioch. What made the schism continue so firmly for centuries was not theological in nature, but the behavior of Western armies raised and sent by Western church leaders to put down the spread of Islam into Jerusalem and territories of the Eastern Church. When the Western Crusaders came to Constantinople to help the Church from persecution, they plundered the city and attempted to set up Latin churches there and elsewhere in the East. History would remember the Crusaders more as misbehaving mercenaries than people protecting their Eastern Orthodox counterparts. Throughout the Church's history, Christians have experienced difficulty when it comes to unity. Separated by language, distance, politics, and theology, the Eastern and Western parts of the Church seem to drift apart, despite persistent attempts to keep the Church unified. While there is one Lord, one faith, and one baptism, Ephesians 4:5, Christians struggle to maintain unity in the Church throughout the world. The Crusades were a set of wars or military campaigns, especially between Western Christians and Muslims in the Eastern Mediterranean world in the 11th through 13th centuries AD. The Crusades have had profound effects on relationships between Christians, Muslims, and Jews to the present day. The word crusade evolved from the word crux, which is Latin for cross, referring to the crosses that Western Christian soldiers wore on their uniforms and shields during the battles. Islam began expanding within the Arabian Peninsula in the 7th century as a result of the life and legacy of Muhammad, the Prophet of Islam. The term Muslim refers to a follower of the religion of Islam, and the term Arab is an ethnic designation for people who come from the Arabian Peninsula and the surrounding regions. The terms are not perfectly interchangeable, though many Arabs are Muslims. When Islam and Arabs expanded into Western Asia, Eastern Europe, Northern Africa, and Spain, it caused great concern among European Christians. Regions conquered by Muslim Arabs were called caliphates, and the caliphs created religious political administrations that created and executed law according to their interpretations of the Quran. The caliphs generally allowed Christians and Jews in their territories to continue to practice their own religions as long as they didn't attempt to build new churches or convert others to their faith, and as long as they paid taxes to the caliph. Judaism, Christianity, and Islam the three most prominent monotheistic religions in world history, all considered Jerusalem to be a holy city. Following the Bar Kokhba rebellion in AD 135, Jews were expelled from Jerusalem by the Roman Empire. When a new eastern capital for the Roman Empire was built in Constantinople, also known as Byzantium, this new capital, now located closer to Jerusalem than Rome had been, oversaw the government of Jerusalem. In the year 636, Byzantine troops were defeated by Muslim troops at the Battle of Yarmouk, after which Muslims occupied and governed Jerusalem. To the Jews, Jerusalem was their political and religious capital. To the Christians, it was the location of much of Jesus Christ's ministry, as well as the place of his death, resurrection, and ascension. To the Muslims, it was the original location Muhammad instructed Muslims to face when praying, and later the location from which he was said to have ascended on his miraculous night journey through the heavens. Jews, Christians, and Muslims have, and still do, earnestly argue for their claims to the holy city of Jerusalem. These arguments became the focal point of the reasons for the Crusades beginning in the 11th century. Although there were multiple causes for Western involvement in the Crusades, the three causes most mentioned by historians are: 1. Concerns about Muslim expansion into formerly Christian lands. 2. The desire for Western pilgrims to visit Jerusalem and Palestine safely. And 3. Hopes for reunification between Western Catholic and Eastern Orthodox Christians. Though there were frequent tensions between Eastern and Western Christians throughout the Middle Ages, the Great Schism occurred in the year 1054 and is the subject of another video. Those who longed for unity between Eastern and Western Christians saw the invasion of Christian lands by Muslims to be a common cause, which might help reunify the Church. Christian pilgrims had been allowed to travel freely to Jerusalem and access the holy places when the city was being governed by the Muslim Fatimids of Egypt. However, in the year 1070, the Muslim Seljuk Turks took Jerusalem from the Fatimids, and from that time, Christian pilgrims returned with stories of oppression and desecration. In 1088, Peter the Hermit's letter to Pope Urban II gave details of the persecution. Byzantine Emperor Alexius I had his own problems to handle in the East. The Byzantine Empire had internal strife, disruptive heresies, and was increasingly isolated from the West. The Byzantine borders were shrinking, and the Byzantine Empire was falling behind other European nations to the west. The Byzantines were also concerned about Muslim expansion from the East. Alexius I sent delegates to Pope Urban II asking for help from the West to assist Alexius I in driving the Turks further to the East. Some of the concerns behind the Crusades were economic in nature too. Italian merchants from Pisa, Genoa, and Venice, for example, were eager to regain safe and productive shipping lanes across all parts of the Mediterranean Sea. Ships from these cities would transport many of the Crusaders to important coastal locations where the Crusades took place. However, transportation of troops via the sea was an expensive matter, and the Italian shipping companies were able to profit from this task. The Pope was not a military leader. Plus, he had no authority over European troops. So, Pope Urban II realized that if he wanted to improve his political standing in Europe and his religious influence throughout the world, he would have to appeal to land-owning nobility to fund and mobilize their own troops for a common cause. The cause was the retaking of Jerusalem from the Seljuk Turks to make pilgrimages safe to Jerusalem and other holy sites for Christians. In November 1095, Urban II presided over the Council of Clermont, where he openly called for the West to provide troops to assist Byzantine Emperor Alexius in his campaign to push back the Turks. Urban II then traveled throughout northern Italy and southern France to convince the nobility that God had given Christians weapons, bravery, and strength to remove holy lands from a cursed and wicked race as a way to ensure their remission of sins and reward of glory in the kingdom of heaven. According to Everett Ferguson, the privilege of the Crusaders to receive forgiveness from punishment for sins had a parallel in the promise to go to paradise given to Muslim warriors in a holy war. Urban's speeches were met with cries of "God wills it." The stage was set for the First Crusade and other crusades that would follow. Though there is disagreement among historians as to which military campaigns should be included among the list of official crusades, there is agreement on what they were: religiously infused Christian military efforts to halt the western spread of Islam and retake Christian control of Jerusalem and other holy places in and around Palestine. Since Jesus' death for the sins of the world was on a cross, the cross became a symbol of Christ's love for the world. Sadly, it also became a symbol of religiously infused warfare and war crimes committed by Western European troops who bore the symbol of the cross on their uniforms and shields. The next video in this series will examine the first and most notable of the Crusades, which took place in the years 1095 to 1099. The First Crusade laid the foundation for later crusades by setting the rationale, method of recruitment, and means by which the military campaigns were carried out. The root cause of the First Crusade was the invasion and capture of Palestine and formerly Christian lands in Eastern Europe by Muslim armies. At first, the Fatimids of Egypt ruled over Palestine and allowed Jews and Christians to worship freely as long as they did not try to convert people to their religion, build new places of worship, or refuse to pay taxes. However, when the Seljuk Turks swept down, expanding southward into Muslim territories, they were converted to Islam, much like the Germanic invaders were converted to Christianity by Western Europeans. The Seljuk Turks took Palestine in 1070 to 1071, including Jerusalem. Afterwards, Christian pilgrims reported persecution and attributed it to the harsher administration of Jerusalem. Byzantine Emperor Alexius I was concerned about access to Jerusalem and other Eastern Christian cities like Alexandria and Antioch. Alexius I even feared that the Byzantine capital of Constantinople might fall to the encroaching Muslims, and since he was faced with internal struggles of his own, he reached out to Pope Urban II for help. Now, the Pope had no control over any military in Western Europe and was involved in disputes of his own with Western kings regarding the relationship between church and state. However, Urban II recognized this as an opportunity to improve three situations. 1. Improve his influence in Western Europe. 2. Help reunite Eastern and Western Christians following the Great Schism of 1054, the subject of another video. And 3. Improve access for pilgrims to Jerusalem and other holy sites in Palestine. Pope Urban II addressed his concerns regarding Jerusalem and the spread of Islam to the Council of Piacenza in March 1095, and later in November at the Council of Clermont. Although the Church had not taken up the sword to fight physical battles, Urban claimed it was no longer safe to go to Jerusalem without weapons. To encourage commoners to enlist, Urban II freed serfs from their responsibilities to their lords during their participation in the Crusade and promised them the same level of pardon for sins as was granted to pilgrims who visited Jerusalem. Urban II also encouraged volunteers to put the sign of the cross on their foreheads and breastplates. Though he did the initial recruiting, Urban II exercised no oversight of the troops or actual fighting. Yet the response to his speeches and actions was far more successful than he had imagined. The Crusaders left Europe in two waves. The first wave was led by Peter the Hermit and Walter the Penniless and consisted mostly of untrained or undertrained peasants. They did not bring enough food for the whole trip, so they pillaged their way across Central Europe, inciting a severe persecution of the Jews living in the region. When the first wave of malnourished crusaders finally arrived in Constantinople, they wandered into the suburbs and pillaged churches, houses, and palaces. Emperor Alexius I decided to send them across the Bosphorus, also known as the Strait of Istanbul, and told them to wait for reinforcements. The Crusaders ignored these instructions and marched forward to Nicaea, where they were slaughtered by a well-trained army of Turks. Walter the Penniless died in battle, and Peter the Hermit returned to Constantinople defeated. The second wave of Crusaders consisted of better-trained soldiers, led mostly by French knights and noblemen. In 1096, they traveled to Constantinople, where they were requested to give an oath of allegiance to the Byzantine emperor, despite their loyalty to their lords and kingdoms. The troops, numbering about 30,000, met with much more success than the first wave of Crusaders. In 1097 to 98, they defeated the Turks in Nicaea, Antioch, Dorylaeum, and Edessa. Finally, in 1099, the 12,000 remaining Crusaders were successful in recapturing Jerusalem from the Turks. Eyewitnesses reported that about 70,000 Muslims and many Jews remaining in the city were killed by the Crusaders. Numbers of the Saracens were beheaded, others were shot with arrows or forced to jump from the towers. Others were tortured for several days and then burned in flames. Women were stabbed to death, babies were flung over the city walls, or had their necks broken by being smashed against posts. The surviving Jews were herded into a synagogue and burned alive. While some scholars today tend to think that there's a measure of exaggeration in such reports, the brutal treatment of those captured remains a source of enmity between Jews, Muslims, Eastern Orthodox, and Roman Catholics even today. The Crusaders set up Western European-style governments in each city they captured from the Muslims. These Crusader states were each ruled by a military leader, whose remaining soldiers protected the cities from future Muslim invasions. Many of these states and fiefs within them were led by French nobility, so the French language became common along the eastern Mediterranean coast as a trade language. Conflict, however, would develop over the rites and rituals of each church and whether it should be led by Western or Eastern clergy. While one of the main purposes of the Crusades was to unify Western and Eastern Christians, the poor behavior and violence of the Crusaders further drove a wedge between the two regions of the Church and set the tone for Muslim conflict with the Western world that continues to this day. The Crusades were a set of wars or military campaigns, especially between Christians and Muslims in the Eastern Mediterranean world in the 11th through 13th centuries AD. The First Crusade laid the foundation for the others. Historians consider at least 6 other military campaigns to be a part of the formal Crusade legacy. The idea of the Crusades continues to impact Christians, Muslims, and Jews up to the present era. The gains made by Crusaders during the First Crusade were only temporary. Crusaders left behind military leaders to govern Jerusalem and other cities they captured from Muslims, and those leaders were eventually replaced by governors elected by the nobility. The Muslim response to the First Crusade was to call for a jihad or holy war. In 1144, Imad al-Din Zengi, Prince of Mosul, led a small, well-trained army to recapture Edessa from Crusader rule, which eventually led to the Second Crusade. Edessa is a city in southeast Turkey, which changed hands frequently between Latin and Byzantine Christians as well as Muslims. It was the main cultural center of northern Syria. In 1146, Bernard of Clairvaux, by the permission of Pope Eugenius III, began preaching in France and Germany to promote the next crusade. In 1147, Emperor Conrad III of Germany and King Louis VII of France led their armies of almost 200,000 troops toward Damascus and Acre. They were repeatedly defeated by the Turks along the way, and barely 1 in 10 crusaders survived. Saladin, a Sunni Muslim who was born in 1137 in Tikrit near Baghdad, rose in the military ranks following his uncle in Egypt. Saladin's uncle had been a general of the Zengid army when he was sent to Egypt to settle a leadership dispute. He took his nephew Saladin with him. In 1169, Saladin took over as Sultan of Egypt and then conquered Damascus in 1174. This laid the foundation for Muslim unity by use of military expertise and wise diplomacy. Saladin and his army conquered important cities in Palestine, such as Acre, Tiberias, Caesarea, Nazareth, and Joppa. But chief among his victories was the retaking of the city of Jerusalem in 1187, which had been ruled by Guy of Lusignan. Though Saladin's rule of these areas was fair and gracious, news of Muslims retaking holy places from the Crusaders resulted in a third crusade. William, the Archbishop of Tyre, returned to Europe and gave an account of how Jerusalem fell back into Muslim hands. In 1189, Emperor Frederick Barbarossa, King Richard the Lion-Hearted of England, and King Philip Augustus of France gathered armies and set off toward the Holy Land to reconquer Jerusalem. Turkish armies challenged Frederick along the way. Many of the soldiers starved, and Frederick himself drowned in a river. Philip and Richard reached Acre in 1191, and after nearly a 2-year siege, the Muslims in the town surrendered to the Crusaders. Philip got sick and returned to France, leaving Richard in charge of the remaining soldiers in Acre. In 1192, Saladin and Richard agreed to a peace in which Christians were granted all coastal cities in the region, and both Muslims and Christians were allowed full access to their own holy cities. However, Jerusalem remained in Muslim control. In the year 1200, Pope Innocent III called for a fourth crusade, but his strategy was to conquer Egypt in the interest of providing a closer launching point for future campaigns to retake Jerusalem. Venetian shipping merchants agreed to transport soldiers to Egypt, but they had no intention of doing so, because the Venetians greatly profited from their trade with Egypt. When French crusaders arrived in Venice in 1202 and were unable to pay the asking price for transportation, the Venetians suggested the crusaders help them conquer Zara, now known as Zadar, Croatia, instead. The crusaders agreed and conquered one of Venice's chief rivals, ironically another Catholic city, much against the will of Pope Innocent III. The Pope excommunicated the crusaders, but then agreed to absolve them if they would return the booty they took from Zara. The Venetians were thankful for the absolution, but kept the booty and transported the crusaders on to Constantinople. The Crusaders successfully took Constantinople, slayed Muslims worshipping in a mosque, looted the churches, raped some of the women, and set up a Latin empire there. The empire lasted from 1204 until 1261, when Byzantine Christians from nearby Nicaea retook Constantinople and returned it to Byzantine rule. There were 4 later campaigns, which have also been referred to as Crusades, but were not nearly on the scale or organization as the first 4. In 1212, a German boy named Nicholas of Cologne incited 30,000 children to go on a children's crusade. They starved, were robbed, some were eaten by wolves, and could not find a ship to transport the surviving children once they arrived in the port city of Genoa. Pope Innocent III told them to return home. Some did, but some stayed in Genoa. In the same year, a French youth by the name of Stephen Cloyes persuaded 20,000 children to accompany him on a crusade. In Marseille, they crowded into 7 ships. 2 wrecked off the coast of Sardinia, and all passengers were drowned. The remaining ships sailed to Tunisia or Egypt, where the children were sold into slavery. In 1217, a 5th crusade left Germany, Austria, and Hungary to sail to Egypt. The crusade was led by King Andrew of Hungary. They captured the Egyptian city of Damietta. The Sultan of Egypt and Syria, Malik al-Kamil, sued for peace, which lasted only a short while. Further fighting resulted in crusaders leaving Egyptian soil with no gains except for an object they believed was the true cross. In 1228, a 6th crusade, led by Emperor Frederick II of Germany and Italy, arrived in Palestine, but received no help from the Christians who lived there. Frederick and Al-Kamil signed a treaty returning Acre, Jaffa, Sidon, Nazareth, Bethlehem, and all of Jerusalem, except for the Dome of the Rock, to Frederick. However, in 1244, the Khwarezmian Turks recaptured Jerusalem, and it once again passed into Muslim hands. In 1248, Louis IX of France organized a 7th crusade, which recaptured Egyptian Damietta. But, facing hunger, disease, and desertion, the Crusaders grew weak and lost again to Muslim forces. The Crusaders escaped to Acre and in 1254 returned to France. In 1267, in what some refer to as an 8th crusade, Louis IX attempted to attack Egypt from the west. He landed his inadequate forces in Tunisia, fell sick, and died there. Prince Edward of England took up his cause and landed in Acre, but after a small amount of fighting, Edward returned to England to claim the throne. In 1291, Sultan Khalil of the Ak-Kuyunlu state sought to avenge a Muslim caravan that was attacked by some Christians in Syria. As a result, he reconquered Acre, Tyre, Sidon, Haifa, and Beirut, massacring or enslaving 60,000 prisoners, and the Crusades finally came to an end. The Crusades left a negative legacy for the Roman Catholic Church among the Jews, Muslims, and Eastern Christians. From that time forward, many types of Western involvement in Eastern affairs have raised the legacy of the worst of Crusader activity. In the West, however, the term crusade would leave a more positive legacy. Any concerted effort on behalf of Western Christians to accomplish a Christian cause might be referred to as a crusade. Examples of efforts also referred to as crusades are monastic orders, evangelistic campaigns, the Inquisitions, and missionary work. By the end of the 12th century, in the spirit of increasingly geopolitical and cross-cultural sensitivity, Western Christians have stopped using the term crusade for most any form of ministry, realizing it triggers a view of Christianity inconsistent with the life and legacy of Jesus. Who is the head of the entire Christian church? The answer is simple: Jesus Christ is. Paul, in his epistle to the Colossians, chapter 1, verse 18, wrote, "He is the head of the body, the church. He is the beginning, the firstborn from the dead, so that he might come to have first place in everything." Paul wrote this verse by the inspiration of the Holy Spirit a full generation after Jesus ascended into heaven to sit at the right hand of God. The answer is simple: Jesus Christ was, is, and always will be the head of the entire Christian church. The biblical book of Hebrews emphasizes his superiority to all creation, including the most prominent of people and angels. However, just before he ascended into heaven, Jesus commissioned his disciples, saying, "As you go out everywhere, make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all the things I have commanded you. And behold, I am with you always until the end of the age." In Jesus' physical presence, his apostles, the word apostle means one who is sent out, were to carry out Jesus' great commission to make disciples of all nations. As Christianity spread around the world and the number of Christians increased, people overseeing local congregations of Christians were referred to as bishops. These bishops sought to lead Christians in carrying out the Great Commission through disciple-making, baptizing, and teaching. In larger cities like Antioch, Ephesus, Rome, and Alexandria, a single bishop would oversee the bishops of individual churches. As Rome and Constantinople became major capitals of the Roman Empire and the Christian population, their bishops became more prominent than bishops of less populated areas. In the year 607, Boniface III, the Bishop of Rome, was the first to assume the title of Universal Bishop, or Pope. The word Pope comes from the Latin word for father. Therefore, when people refer to the Bishop of Rome as the Pope, they are referring to him as the Bishop of all bishops, or the Father of the Christian Church. Rome became the most prominent of all locations ruled by a bishop in the Church. If we move forward in time to the 14th century, we find the political and economic situation in Rome worsening, while the political and economic situation in France was improving. The activity and focus of the Western Church had moved northward from Rome to France. The popes were given a residence in Avignon, a town in southern France, where the popes preferred to live from 1309 to 1377. The 7 popes who lived in Avignon were all French and were under the influence of the French monarchy. Roman Christians had lost their bishop to France. This absence of the pope from Rome had been referred to as the Babylonian captivity of the Church. The popes in Avignon were also criticized for their extensive spending. 2 notable women called for the return of the Pope to Rome. Saint Brigida of Sweden joined a group of pilgrims headed toward Rome in 1350 for what was called a Year of Jubilee. As was the case with the Year of Jubilee in the Old Testament era with the Israelites, so in the 14th century, Pope Clement VI called for a canceling of debt, a return of property to original owners, and a time of thanksgiving for those who survived the Black Plague. When Gregory XI became Pope in 1370, Brigida warned him she had seen a vision that if he kept away from the papal residence in Rome, he would die prematurely. Likewise, Saint Catherine of Siena, a prophetess and miracle worker from Tuscany, warned Gregory to do his duty in Rome rather than return to exile in France, which was the cause, she reported, of all the problems the Church was experiencing then. Gregory heeded their warnings and returned to Rome at the end of 1377. A few months later, in 1378, he died. Imagine the situation. After about 70 years of this Babylonian captivity of the Church, the French wanted a French pope, and the Italians wanted an Italian pope. An Italian mob formed in Rome, and they prevented the cardinals from leaving the city. The trapped cardinals had to elect a successor to Gregory, so they chose Urban VI. Pope Urban came from a humble financial background and loathed the rich life the French popes and cardinals had been living. He appointed enough new Italian cardinals that they outnumbered the French ones. The remaining French cardinals were scared off, ran to Anagni, and claimed they were forced to vote under duress, that the election of Urban should be voided. They therefore elected their own Clement VII to be Gregory's rightful successor. Well, this created a situation with two popes. The French pope lived in Avignon again. He immediately took up arms against the Roman pope. While the military action was unsuccessful, it did finalize the schism between the French and Italian popes. Neither recognized the other as valid. France and Scotland recognized the French pope. Italy, England, Scandinavia, Hungary, and Poland recognized the Italian pope. Germany, Portugal, Castile, and Aragon shifted back and forth. International lines of papal loyalty were drawn, and sometimes the choice was based on international political reasons. What a mess! Who would solve the problem of the dual papacy? Back in the year 325, when the Church became divided over the full and eternal deity of Christ, Emperor Constantine called a council to meet in Nicaea to settle the matter. Bishops representing every major area in which Christianity had spread gathered to listen to all sides and prayerfully and corporately recognized the truth. For over 1,000 years after the Council of Nicaea, larger councils and smaller synods continued to meet to listen to, discuss, and pray about matters of theology and faith. Therefore, many Christians called for a general council to solve the problem. In the battles for political power between kings and popes, the council also emerged as a powerful group of people. When the French and Italian popes heard that a general council would be called, they each proactively called their own councils, but those failed, and each pope retreated to his own stronghold. A general council met in Pisa, Italy, in 1409 to solve the papal schism. It had the support of both sets of cardinals as well as the courts around Europe. The council declared that both of the popes were unworthy of their positions, both were to be deposed, and Alexander V should be recognized as the one universal pope. The Council of Pisa then adjourned and returned each to their own home. However, the French and Italian popes refused to recognize the decision of the council, so the Church ended up with 3 popes instead of 2. What a mess all over again! A second council was convened by Emperor Sigismund and the Pisan Pope John XXIII in Constance, a town in southwest Germany. The Council of Constance, which met from 1414 to 1417, enjoyed considerably more authority than its predecessor in Pisa. John thought the council would depose the French and Italian popes, leaving him as the one true pope. However, John soon realized that there were many accusations circulating through the council regarding his own poor behavior, so he snuck away in disguise. He was later captured, returned to Constance, and imprisoned for the rest of his life. The French Pope, Benedict XIII, took refuge in Peñascola, Spain, where he continued to claim he was the rightful pope, but no one paid attention to him, and a replacement was not named after he died in 1423. The Italian Pope, Gregory XII, resigned on his own free will, which allowed for a brand new pope, and only one pope, Martin V, to be elected by the council. The council adopted a principle called haec sancta, which recognized the authority of a proper council as being above the popes but below Christ. However, Martin and subsequent popes began to show more zeal and ability, so the need for a general council decreased. The end result was that the conciliar movement solved the problem of the papal schism, but then faded into obscurity from that time forward. Popes would continue to call councils to meet at the Pope's command in the Western Church up to the present day. However, these Catholic councils would never again wield authority over the popes in terms of choosing a pope or deciding on theological matters in opposition to a pope. The Babylonian captivity of the Church in the 14th century and the papal schism of the 14th and 15th centuries were a dark time for proponents of the papacy. These events were commonly referred to by Protestants during the 16th century Reformation as rationale for Christians pulling themselves away from their ties to Rome and focusing instead directly on their relationships with God. Toward the end of the Middle Ages, Europe experienced a general revival of the interest in human beings, art, and literature. This revival was afterwards referred to as the Renaissance. The word Renaissance is French for rebirth. It was called this for two important reasons. First, the Black Plague, which swept through Europe and killed 1/3 of the human population, was coming to an end. People had more optimism that they were going to live now that the Black Plague was subsiding. Second, the movement was a revival in academic matters and appreciation for the power and beauty of the human being. It felt like an escape from the Dark Ages. The spirit of optimism and free inquiry swept through Europe and caused a revival, especially in arts and literature. It may be helpful to draw a few contrasts between the Dark Ages and the Renaissance. In the Dark Ages, in Europe, ideas about art and education were controlled by the Roman Catholic Church. Artists and educators used religious methods to meet religious goals. In the Renaissance, the focus became people and creation rather than heaven and angels. The methods artists and educators used in the Renaissance were driven by the skill of human observation and science. Research and discovery in the Renaissance era were for the sake of discovery, wherever it would lead. In the Dark Ages, it seemed that research was intended to support the status quo, whether in politics or the church. Therefore, Renaissance thinkers and artists were regarded as rebels, to a degree. As Renaissance ideas traveled northward across the Alps into Germany and Switzerland, the movement came to be known as humanism because of its emphasis on the human mind and body. Portraits of saints in the Dark Ages were darker in color and somber in mood. People were portrayed as suffering or waiting on God to deliver them. The human mind was tortured by spiritually dark forces and the heaviness of sin. In humanism, people's minds and bodies got to be celebrated. To the humanist, the human mind was capable of understanding truths on its own inquiry. People did not need to be spoon-fed the truth of the church. They could research and come to their own conclusions. The human mind was valuable, and the human body was valued as well. Renaissance art revived realism that celebrated the nuances of the human body. Veins, muscles, shadows, eyes, and other parts of the body were carefully researched and represented in art. Leonardo da Vinci, for example, used to cut open cadavers to research how best to represent the human body in his art. The human body and the human mind became beautiful again, not tortured, but celebrated. In the Dark Ages, portrayals were especially made of famous people, but in the Renaissance era, common people with their common lives were also portrayed in art. This emphasis on art among the common people was a welcome change. The ancient Greeks were not afraid to celebrate the beauty of human anatomy. This trend revived itself in the art of the Renaissance. The Renaissance itself can be traced back to Florence, Italy, during the height of the power of the Medici family. The plague hit the town of Florence hard. In 1348, about 40% of the town's population succumbed to the plague. As the town was rebuilding, the Medici family patronized the arts and commissioned beautiful paintings and sculptures to adorn houses and the public square. Some of these sculptures included nude portrayals of people. Conservative townspeople objected. A famous preacher by the name of Girolamo Savonarola preached energetically against this new direction in art. He successfully had the Medici family expelled from the city, but soon after, they returned, and Savonarola was burned at the stake. Although the church did not embrace the new art at first, one of the Medici family ascended to the papacy and took the name Leo X. He did patronize the arts and sought to bring the same type of Renaissance paintings to Rome to adorn his new St. Peter's Cathedral. Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel, which he painted in 1508 to 1512, is an example of the religious application of Renaissance art in Rome. Soon, churches around Europe embraced the new style of realistic human portrayals, and Renaissance art found its way into cathedrals and chapels around Europe. Besides issuing a new era in art, the Renaissance was also a time of revival and interest in ancient Greek and Latin literature. As Muslim troops made further inroad toward Constantinople, even in the 14th century, Greek scholars began removing some important ancient Greek literature from Constantinople's collection and transferring it west. When the Greek scholars and classic Greek literature arrived, it sparked a renewed interest in the Greek language and literature. One of the most helpful contributions to the Church of this newfound interest in ancient Greek literature was improved studies on the New Testament. The New Testament was originally written in Koine Greek, and the earliest manuscripts of the New Testament were also in Greek. Therefore, students of the Bible who wanted to dig into the New Testament in its original language had many more resources to help them translate and discuss the original language. Erasmus of Rotterdam, a leading humanist of the early 16th century, collected ancient Greek manuscripts of the New Testament and published a Greek text that became a standard Greek text for translators up to the present day. There was also a renewed interest in classical Latin literature such as Cicero, Virgil, and Horace. Literary experts began engaging in literary criticism, in which various sources of the same writing were compared and contrasted to figure out which source contained the correct form of the earlier writing. All of this interest in ancient Greek and Roman literature not only created a science of investigating ancient literature, but an awareness that there was a great body of ancient secular literature that was worthy of studying. The Church had long banned, or at least discouraged, the reading of ancient secular literature, so this revival of interest in ancient sources seemed somewhat rebellious to the Church. People who believed the Church had headed in the wrong direction, especially concerning the financial spending of 14th century popes in France, the subject of another video, now had another set of ancient literature to consider. One of the reasons an interest in literature was able to take off during this era was the invention of the printing press. Johannes Gutenberg invented a system of movable type in 1439, and by 1455, copies of the Gutenberg Bible began circulating around Europe. Before the invention of the printing press, copies of books were too expensive for middle or lower class readers. However, once the process of printing was mechanized, the price of books dropped considerably, and the quantity of books increased notably. This invention helped perpetuate humanist ideas and eventually allowed criticism of the Church to circulate more widely. The Reformation in the 16th century was also greatly helped along by the invention of the printing press. Theologically speaking, the emphasis on humanity and art brought with it a renewed interest in theological anthropology, or the theological issues related to being a human being. Erasmus, for example, wrote On the Freedom of the Will, which claimed that both people and God are essential to a person's receiving grace. Whereas the thought of the Augustinian scholars throughout the Middle Ages was that salvation is completely a matter of God's grace, Erasmus suggested that people actively use their free will to choose God. The Renaissance prompted theological questions about the abilities and properties of human beings as a primary subject of inquiry. The Renaissance and humanism, which surfaced suddenly after the subsiding of the Black Plague, started in Italy and moved northward as far as Scotland. It revived an interest in the human body and mind, as well as an interest in classical Greek and Latin literature. It would be one of several waves of secular thought that would challenge the assumptions and traditions of the Christian Church. The Church would sometimes embrace it and sometimes shun it, but the Renaissance and humanism laid a foundation for further church reforming thoughts, especially the Protestant Reformation in the 16th century.